Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students, I'm pretty sure we do have students in the room, but also online, dear guests, it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to Unidistant Swiss for the inaugural lecture of Professor Bernhard Schär. Inaugural lectures are important moments in life of university institutions. They reflect our commitment to research, teaching, and academic exchange across cultures and disciplines. We are therefore delighted to officially welcome Professor Schär to Unidistant Swiss and wish him every success and inspiration in his work with our institution. I would also like to thank everyone who contributed to his appointment, and obviously also to everyone who helped with the organization of this evening. And the academic introduction of Professor Schär will now be given by the Dean of the Faculty of History, Professor Christina Späti. And I thank you for your attention and wish you a very pleasant evening. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Wait till everybody has found a seat. It's pretty crowded in here. We are, of course, pleased. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students, I am very pleased to share with you in the following some key highlights of Bernhard Schär's academic career. When you joined Unidistant as Associate Professor of Contemporary History in December 2025, he already had an impressive professional path behind him. Due to time considerations, I can only mention a few key moments. Bernhard received his PhD from the University of Bern and then took on a postdoc position at the Chair of Global History at ETH Zurich, where he led his first research group called Swiss Tools of Empires on the history of Swiss mercenaries in the Dutch colonial army in the 19th century. After a Marie Curie Fellowship at the Käthe Homburger Kolleg Global Disconnect at the University of Munich, he became a Swiss National Science Foundation Excellenza Professor at the University of Lausanne in 2022. There he led the international research group called A Collaborative History of Global Switzerland. His dissertation, published in 2015 as Tropenliebe, Schweizer Naturforscher und niederländischer Imperialismus 1900, played a key role in establishing the field of colonial studies in Switzerland. In fact, Bernhard called for a post-colonial history of Switzerland to be written as early as 2007. Since then, post-colonial studies in Switzerland have garnered considerable attention and have generated significant research on the cultural and social ties between Switzerland and the colonies. Bernhard has also continued to contribute to this research. He has focused on the history of science, global history, and colonial history, with a regional emphasis on the relationships between Europe, Switzerland, and South and Southeast Asia, Southern Africa, and Brazil. His work on the history of Swiss mercenaries in the Dutch colonial army, as well as his study on slavery on Swiss-owned plantations in Brazil, and on missionary activities in India and Southern Africa in the 19th century, combine global and colonial historical perspective with social history and gender studies. Let me mention but a few important journal articles Bernhard authored in this context. Formative Spaces of Empire, Masculinities and Outdoor Experiences, 1860 to 1960, published 2024 in the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History with Thomas Bartoletti. Then Welfare for War Veterans, How the Dutch Empire Provided for European Mercenary Families, 1850 to 1914, published 2023 in Itinerario with Philipp Grauer. And finally, Switzerland, Borneo, and the Dutch Indies towards a new imperial history of Europe, 1770 to 1850, published 2022 in Past and Present. Bernhard's research has also received major international attention, resulting in invitations to Berlin, Singapore, Leiden, Paris, and Munich, to mention but a few. Teaching and sharing knowledge with a wider audience are activities that are also very close to Bernhard's heart, and in which he is actively involved. In addition to teaching at various universities, including Unidistance since 2017, he has developed several teaching materials on a variety of topics. He also regularly shares his knowledge through media appearances. He has served, among others, as the principal scientific advisor for the exhibition at the Swiss National Museum in Zurich, named Colonial, Globale Verflechtungen der Schweiz, which is currently on view at Château de Prangin. Finally, something not every professor can say about themselves, his dissertation served as the basis for a theatre play that was performed at Theater Basel in 2019 and 20 under the title Wiederaufstehung der Vögel. It is my deep conviction that the basis of historical scholarship is to critically examine the past. Past injustices must be brought to light, and marginalized voices must be made heard. And we have to endure the problematic interconnections, past injustices, and controversial debates that emerge in this process. Ultimately, all of these contributes to a more realistic picture of history, including the history of Switzerland. Bernhard, in your research, and in all your other activities too, you pursue this goal with great dedication. And I am therefore not only delighted, but also proud that you are now a member of our faculty. And now, please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Bernhard to the floor for his inaugural lecture, Where Were the Swiss, Switzerland and the Making of European Empire?
Wow, this is overwhelming. So yeah, I rolled my sleeves up because this is also work. So let's get to it. Thank you, first of all, Nicolas, for the very kind introductory remarks, and thank you, Christina, for this very generous and warm also introduction. It is an honor and also very humbling to stand in front of all of you here today in Brieg, in this room, and I think there are many more also zooming in online from different parts of Switzerland, Europe, and indeed the world. With this lecture, as Christina's already mentioned, entitled Where Were the Swiss, Switzerland and the Making of Modern Empire. Now, before I get into it, I should probably acknowledge that this question might sound a little bit different here where we are in the canton of Valais. For those unfamiliar with Swiss geography, so Valais is one of the southern cantons of Switzerland, separated from the rest of Switzerland by this high mountain range, and people from the northern parts of the Alps in Switzerland therefore always referred to Valais as a peripheral canton. A view, however, that people here from Valais have always responded to with a very nice irony. So they would call people like me from the northern flatlands as the Ausserschweizer in German, so the people from outer Switzerland. So in fact, the Valais here is the center, the rest of Switzerland is periphery. Now, beyond this Swiss bantering, I think they do have a point. Valais was indeed, of course, as was also Switzerland, connected to the wider world. This is the theme that I'd like to explore with you today, and I'm starting with this image here. It's an advertisement from the 1920s advertising a luxury train line, the Orient Express, which had several different branches. One of them, the Simplon Orient Express, that started in the 1920s and ran until fairly recently. In this advertisement here, you can see, interestingly enough, how it connects London, the then imperial metropole, all the way to the Middle East, and from there, of course, on to India and the other British colonies, not only on the fastest possible track, as the advertisement says, but also the most picturesque route, and who could disagree? So, what I like about this advertisement, that it shows then in the very center, of course, we see then Brig, where we are today, and also the Simplon tunnel. So this remarkable awareness of global interconnectedness, and indeed the central role that Valais and the rest of Switzerland plays with it, is something, of course, that I love, that speaks to me. But, and this is where I would like to start, as we all know, in the last 100 years or so, this view has gradually been replaced by something else, a much more inward-looking image of Switzerland's role in the world. Take this example. This is the cover of the most recent summary of Swiss national history, published in 2015, spanning the time from the antiquities to the very present. And visually, Switzerland here appears completely different, namely disconnected, small, isolated, white, interestingly enough, surrounded by this very abstract red space, without geography, without structures, without connections, seemingly totally irrelevant to understand the history of this small white country on the cover. Now, to be fair, the scholarship inside of this book is extremely rich, and it is still relevant today. It reflects decades of important work done in social history, gender history, migration history, touching on very important topics such as Switzerland's role during National Socialism and others. However, the cover is telling, because this narrative contextualizes Switzerland in a very vague and implicit idea of the West, which somehow seems to include Germany, France, Britain, the US maybe. The non-West, however, plays hardly a role at all, and in this way we can see how these nationalist ideas that were forged in the 20th century of smallness, of isolation and whiteness also quietly structure the narrative of the story being told in this book. And this is not just a pattern of this book. If you look at other scholarly and also popular histories that have been published since the early 2000s, you find very similar patterns, often even similar visual languages on their covers. In different ways and in different degrees, they situate Switzerland in this vague idea of the West, or of an idea of a supposedly self-contained Europe with little or no connections to the so-called rest of the world. These ideas, of course, are neither neutral nor innocent. They are very powerful because of what they leave out. They have no real discussions with European and also Swiss colonial entanglements. They have no sustained engagements with non-European experiences, voices, actors, co-producers of our shared modern histories, and they also have no or little awareness that whiteness was in fact a racial category invented by Europeans to justify colonial rule abroad, and therefore they have also no or little concept of colonial racism, which was so important for the history of European cultures in the time of modernity. So, if we return to my question, where were the Swiss and what role did Switzerland play in empire, then until fairly recently, the implicit but nevertheless powerful answer was quite simply, well, the Swiss were always here on this small white patch, and their country played no meaningful role in European imperial expansion. Now again, the scholarship in this book, of course, is extremely critical of the ways in which of political uses and misuses of historical narratives. It was, however, at that time still fully aligned with the stance of the Swiss federal government in foreign policy. As you all know, Swiss foreign policy is kind of rooted in the idea of neutrality, which includes also very explicit ideas that have been voiced by all members of the multi-party coalition government in different ways, namely that Switzerland, because it had no colonial history, because it had no involvement in slavery, it is uniquely positioned to play the role as a neutral mediator between formerly colonizing and formerly colonized countries. Now, we all know now that this is, of course, far from accurate. These narratives, the popular ones and also the scholarly ones, had, in a certain sense, missed the Simplon on Orient Express. Post-colonial critique and global history writing had already left the station and had been picking up speed internationally and in Switzerland when these books were published. Starting in the early 2000s, from the margins at first of our discipline and then also from outside of academia, new works were being published, intervening not only in their visual language, as we can see here from their book covers, but also through new research revealing different ways of Swiss involvements in transatlantic slavery, in colonialism, and both in scientific and popular racism. Many of these books also insisted on something else, namely that the colonial ways of thinking did not simply disappear in Europe and in Switzerland after decolonization, but rather continued into the very present and indeed also formed the historical evolution of the historical sciences or the social sciences in European and Swiss universities. This shift, of course, did not just come from inside of academia, quite the contrary. Civil society movements had been, internationally and in Switzerland, had been challenging how colonial images persisted for quite a long time, be it in school books, in museums, in statues, in the public sphere, in everyday languages, and how these images then sustained a certain culture, sustaining structural discrimination, including also instances of police violence against black and non-white minorities. This broader movement, we all remember, reached a visible peak during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, and internationally, including Switzerland, saw a very striking response. Within just 5 years or so, we saw that many of the major museums in Switzerland started organizing for the very first time exhibitions on Swiss colonial history, drawing record numbers of visitors. Teaching materials in schools were critically revised and are still being revised as we speak. Voices that for a long time had no or very little representation in media, cultural institutions, and indeed also universities found a wide range of alternative public formats, being it podcasts, films, theaters, books, to engage new audiences in this dialogue that we are still in. This remarkable shift in public awareness then also reached the highest political levels in Switzerland. At the opening of the colonial exhibition at the Swiss National Museum that Christina just mentioned in 2024, Federal Councillor Elisabeth Bohm-Schneider stated, quote, "The time has come to take a more honest look at our history. Swiss history cannot be neatly separated from the history of colonialism." Now, this was a significant change. Post-colonial perspectives, global history that were marginal, if not absent, only 10 years ago in the master narratives are now seem to be moving closer to the centers of cultural institutions and indeed also political discourse. And this, of course, raises very serious questions for us as historians. How do we remain critical toward political uses of historical narratives, especially when they now start building on our very own research? How do we continue to question our own ways of historical knowledge productions, our concepts, our tools? I won't be able to answer this fully here today, but what I would like to do is outline 3 guiding ideas that have emerged in dialogue with so many of you here today and watching online. over the past 10, 20 years. Two of those ideas have guided my work so far, but I'd like to add a third one to the research agenda of this professorship here at Unidistance. So the basic idea is using Swiss case studies allows us to rethink, first of all, again, the idea of wideness of Swiss history and move towards a Swiss global history. Secondly, and almost automatically, this also then leads us to a new history of the role of empire in Europe. Thirdly, then I'd like to add another point. I think it's also time now, in a certain sense, to return home, to join forces with colleagues who have been doing critical work here on the history of violence within Swiss society. Now, this sounds very abstract. I know I will walk you through this using very, very concrete examples and following a very simple principle well known in public history: dig where you stand. And in this case, I mean this quite literally. I mean, start digging, not right here, but 700 meters away from here in Brig, where we find this monument that my team and I went to inspect the other day in preparing today's lecture. It honors one of Brig's most celebrated citizens, Ernest Guglielminetti. His father had migrated from Domodossola, hence the Italian name, but Guglielminetti was born here in Brig in 1862 and then received honorary citizenship in 1942 and is today mostly remembered as Dr. Goudron. Goudron is the French name for tar or teer in German, and Goudron is credited with having introduced tarred road surfaces in the early 1900s, a very consequential innovation. It was part of a dramatic transformation of traffic and roads in the early 1900s from these horse-drawn wagons on dusty gravel roads to motor vehicles on nicely paved surfaces as we know them today. And this is one of the reasons why Dr. Goudron's legacy is still very present and alive today, at least here in Brig. Just a few days ago, as every year, cyclists from across Europe gathered here in Brig for the Goudron Bike Days. I don't know, some of you might have also participated. So together, as every year, they rode up the Simplon Pass, attended a Sunday Mass, and received the priest's blessing for the opening of the pass after the snow had melted, but also in honor of Dr. Goudron, whose invention made this pastime possible. Now, if we are to historicize Goudron more critically, and this won't come as a surprise, we need to put him in a much larger global context, because he did not simply invent this technique of road tarring. It was more of an adaptation, or maybe even a cultural appropriation, as we would say today. At any rate, he encountered this technique in Sumatra, which is today in one of the largest islands in Indonesia, then part of the Dutch colonial empire, while serving as a medical officer in the Dutch colonial army. There he observed how indigenous communities used this tarring technique to seal some of their bamboo structures, and it is from there that he brought this knowledge here to Europe and then developed it into this tarring technique. But beyond tarring, Goudron allows us to see something more if we turn to the actual sources, among them letters that he sent home from Sumatra to Brig, to his mother. This is an example from 1888, where he writes how much he misses his family here in Brig, his Walliser Heimat, so his Valais home country. But what he mostly then writes about and complains about in this letter is about costs for a large crate that his brother Guillaume had sent him from Brig. I'll give you just a short extract of this letter. So he writes, "I'd like to know the full details of the shipping costs from Brig to Marseille. I find the postage from Brig to Padang, which was the major trading port in Sumatra, 100 francs a bit steep, as Marseille to Padang can't possibly cost more than 50 francs. Guillaume, my brother, must find a better route. I think via Italy, perhaps Göschenen, Milano, Brindisi, Port Said, Padang, or Genoa, Port Said, Padang. Now, the quote, I think, is remarkable because it shows us, first of all, how deeply embedded even small towns such as Brieg were in these infrastructures connecting Europe to the colonies. And secondly, it also shows us the knowledge and the awareness that people had of this. Gudrun seems to know exactly how to calculate shipping routes, to compare costs, optimize logistics. And if you think back at the advertisement that I showed you at the beginning of this talk, this letter here shows the same thing from a different angle, namely that these infrastructures did not just connect Brieg to Switzerland to Europe, but rather connected also Brieg all the way to colonial Sumatra through French, Italian, Dutch, and other routes. So again, we should not think of these spaces as separate worlds, evolving historically separated from each other. They were part of an integrated space forged, among others, by these expanding European empires. But the letter allows us also to see how Guglielminetti used these infrastructures to his own advantage. So in the letter, he gives his mother very, very precise instructions on how to organize the next shipment more effectively. He tells her to tell his brother how to pack these crates, and he gives a list here that you can see on the left, and I transcribed it for you. So what he writes is that he wants actually several different crates, and crate number 1, he wants 12 bottles of Valais wine, fondant. He wants a pair of slippers embroidered in blue, a salami sausage, he was half Italian, 6 tablecloths, 30 bottles of Pilsner export beer, 1 tin of English biscuits, and 1 tin of Basler Leckerli, and also 3 bottles of perfume, etc., etc. Now, this is interesting because it shows us that Guglielminetti was not only using this infrastructure to move goods from one part of the world to the other, he's also using these goods to recreate a new world around him in Sumatra with tablecloths, with slippers, wine, and also newspapers from home. In another part of the letter, he mentions how he regularly reads the Walliser Bote that still runs to this very day. This is interesting because it gives us an understanding how these Europeans tried to create a world for themselves in the colonies behind the scenes, so to speak, because like most European men, Guglielminetti himself staged himself as this lonely, manly, colonial conqueror and explorer in photos that he had taken of him to send back home to his family. So what I did for today's lecture is ask artificial intelligence to use this historical photograph and to combine it with some of the information that we find in his private letters that he had sent to his mother. And this is what the artificial intelligence came up with. It's this slightly absurd image of Dr. Gudrun in Sumatra with his blue embroidered slippers, his fondant and his Leckerli, his salami, and indeed the Walliser Bote. But I think it captures something important here. Gudrun was not simply being manly and European in Sumatra. He was not even being simply Swiss. He was creating a gentlemanly vision of Valais around him, or to put it differently, he was trying to recreate his beloved Brieg there in Sumatra. And in doing so, he was also performing a form of imperial whiteness and masculinity, one in which local and regional identities like Valais seemed to belong quite naturally. Now, placing Gudrun and his beloved Walliser Heimat in a more global context is an important first step, but it is not enough. Global histories can never rely on Swiss and European sources alone, and indeed, the archives as the main foundation of academic history writing needs to be constantly questioned. It too is a product of histories of power and violence that we are trying to reconstruct, marginalizing the majority of global populations, at least in the 19th century, colonized populations, women, of course, lower class actors, and others. Global history, therefore, needs to work not only with, but also against the archive, as feminist and post-colonial scholars have shown us time and again. In the case at hand, we now really need to place Gudrun in this Southeast Asian historical context and emphasize that he was not in Sumatra primarily to drink fondant or read the Walliser Bote. He was there for one main reason, and that was to help maintain the fighting capacity of the Dutch colonial army. At that time, that army was engaged in one of the longest and most brutal colonial wars of the 19th century, the war against the Muslim Sultanate of Aceh in northern Sumatra. Aceh managed to resist Dutch expansion for almost 40 years, with devastating, which was really devastating for them. Up to 100,000 people were killed, both soldiers and civilians. Dutch military strategy at the time relied heavily on spreading fear and terror, using forms of violence that would have been considered war crimes back in Europe already back then, but were systematically used by most colonial armies in the 19th century. To sustain this kind of warfare, colonial armies needed manpower, and a lot of it. Much of the manpower came from the empire itself, from colonized populations, but it also included thousands of European men, not only from the Netherlands. Around 40% of the European soldiers came from Belgium, from Germany, from France, and from Switzerland. Most of them did, of course, not have this upper middle class background like Guglielminetti. They came from more modest, often precarious social situations, enlisting because of economic hardship, some also just for the adventure, but others also to escape social persecution, something that I will return to later. These men then served alongside indigenous soldiers, often as low-ranking officers, lived in close proximity with them, adopting local practices, namely heavy drinking, and oftentimes had very low survival rates and were frequently described by men like Guglielminetti as undisciplined and morally suspect. For these upper-class Europeans, both the colonized and low-class Europeans fell short of what they considered a civilized European upper-middle-class lifestyle with tablecloths or even with fondant. Equally important and even less visible in these sources were women and children. Many or most were indigenous or of mixed background. Girls, often very young, were employed as so-called housekeepers for European soldiers. In practice, this meant forced domestic labor and frequently also sexual exploitation. Military barracks included separate quarters for these arrangements, so these women cooked, cleaned, cared for their soldiers and helped them learn the local languages and navigate local or regional environments. They too were essential to maintain not only everyday life, but indirectly at least also the army's fighting capacity. And yet they were unpaid, and they are largely absent from the archives. Men like Guglielminetti, as you can imagine, hardly ever mentioned these women in their letters back home to their mothers. Bringing these actors into our narratives is, however, not only simply a matter of historical fairness, it is analytically crucial, because it is precisely their knowledge, their labor, their actions ranging from complicity to subversion and resistance that helps us explain how these imperial formations actually worked across these large spaces between Europe and Asia. They help explain, for example, how soldiers survived in these environments, but they also help explain how at certain points in the 19th century, large numbers of Europeans, including Swiss men, ended up in these colonial war zones in the first place. The reason is simple. Colonial rule was constantly challenged. Rebellions, anti-colonial resistance forced empires, as in this case the Dutch Empire, to expand their military recruitment practices, creating a demand for new fighting men to do the dirty work of empire, reaching far beyond the home country of the Netherlands, even into places that might appear remote, such as the Upper Valley here in Switzerland. So, if we return to our initial question, where were the Swiss, we can now see that this is only a starting point for historical inquiry. A global history of Switzerland cannot be limited to the actions of these Swiss men abroad, and more broadly, histories of empire can never remain focused only on a small group of European men who held these positions of power. We need firstly to contextualize these men by placing them in relation to these women, colonized societies and others around them. And then secondly, we need to enter into what our French-speaking colleagues call les jeux d'échelle, so zooming in and zooming out and employing different analytical scales. If we do this with Guglielminetti, we see that he was just one example among thousands of Swiss men in Dutch colonial services. And indeed, he was only one of hundreds of thousands of Europeans who worked for the Dutch Empire over several centuries. This map shows the origins of roughly 800,000 European employees in the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. And what it makes clear is that obviously the Dutch never built their empire alone. They relied on people, capital, expertise from across Europe, including Switzerland. This is one of the central arguments in my first research group that I had the pleasure to lead as a postdoctoral researcher at ETH Zurich under the guidance and mentorship of Harald Fischer-Tiné. It has since developed into a broader field of research, not least through the groundbreaking and multiple award-winning work done by Philipp Krauer and Monique Lichtenberg, present here today. I am deeply indebted to them, not only for many of the facts and examples that I've presented so far, but for being in conversation for so many years, thinking through these matters. Now, why does all this matter? Well, Philipp, Monique, I and others, what we are trying to challenge is this very persistent assumption that imperial history is about national empires. We are still very much used to think of the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, other empires with seemingly clear-cut boundaries competing with one another. This Wikipedia map is just a case in point. And although this history is not entirely false, it is just very, very one-sided. Empires also build shared infrastructures which enable them to collaborate across these multiple national and imperial boundaries to mobilize people, capital, knowledge from across many different borders. This is one of the main insights that our research on the transimperial military labor market, what it revealed. But of course, military labor is just one part of the picture. If we then widen the lens, we find similar patterns in other fields. So during my project at the University of Lausanne, my colleague Amal Shahid, who can unfortunately not be with us here today, and I have been working a lot on Protestant missionary societies. What we see is from the early 19th century onwards, Switzerland became home of some of the largest missionary societies in continental Europe. This map here shows the place of origin and deployment of missionaries trained by the Basel Missionary Society in the 19th century. What it shows is striking. It shows how Basel became a hub or a gateway for young, pious men, mainly from German-speaking Protestant regions, but not only, and from there, how they were then sent across the world to Africa, to Asia, the Middle East, the Americas. Like the military networks that I talked about earlier, these were not national networks, they were transimperial networks, and what connected these actors was not nationality or a shared language, but in this case, religion, which included a shared worldview, a worldview that classified non-Christians as heathens, as inferior, with a lifestyle and culture in need of eradication and transformation into Christianity. At the same time, these encounters too, they were not one-sided. Missionaries in different ways than mercenaries also met resistance, adaptation, negotiation, and this, of course, fed back into Europe through missionary journals, calendars, fundraising campaigns, educational materials, Sunday schools. They continuously shaped religious and cultural life here in Switzerland and beyond. So again, if we start digging in Switzerland, we uncover networks through which Europeans collaborated across their national and linguistic divisions toward shared imperial goals and ideals. What our Lausanne project emphasized, however, which has now become the Unidistance project, is the idea of collaborative research. All of these histories are documented in multiple archives and multiple languages, not only German, French, English, Dutch, etc., but also in Malayalam, in Kannada, in Tulu, in Sesotho. It is impossible for any single historian or one team to examine all these archives alone. We therefore collaborate with partners from across the world, and it is here that I'd like to take the opportunity to shout out to Parinita, Nanda Kishore, JP, who are zooming in from India, and to Dineo Sekhoete, who is listening in from Lesotho in southern Africa. Without their work, this project would have never been possible. A first fruit of this collaborative method of global history is this recent publication, co-edited by Amal Shahid, together with our friends Mukesh Kumar and Ella Müller, also present here today with us. It's the fruit. It combines for the very first time scholars from India and from Switzerland who have been working through this material together and are interpreting and narrating it from different European and Asian perspectives. Let me briefly mention one more example, Brazil. Isabel Barros and Michael Schmitz, also present here today. Their ongoing research follows a similar methodology, focusing, however, not on military or missionary networks, but rather on finance and trade. Isabel is looking at how Swiss plantation owners came to play a key role in ambivalently modernizing Brazil's slave-based economy from the 1820s onward until abolition in the 1880s. And Michael then looks at how Swiss cacao exporters then integrated also this new cash crop into global markets in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What both projects show is, again, how Swiss actors had access, in this case, to European capital and know-how, and how they thereby helped integrate Brazil into these global markets. This is a professional map drawn up from Isabel's project, showing the location of the correspondence partners of one key Swiss plantation owner in Bahia in Brazil. And what it shows us that, of course, unsurprisingly, he corresponded with other slave and plantation owners in Brazil, but he was also in constant dialogue and exchange with banks, trading houses, and others, elites in Europe's and the US's major finance centers, Paris, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, London, Bern, New York, and others. So again, this research shows how these Swiss actors were embedded in imperial economies and how their networks operated across national and imperial boundaries. But this perspective also allows us to reverse the lens, because Isabel's main focus is on the experiences and the resistance of these enslaved women and children on Swiss-owned plantations, and how their fate shaped these emerging global markets for Brazilian coffee and other goods. Again, this is a vast history, a violent history that cannot be examined alone and interpreted alone. This became particularly clear at a recent conference that we organized last year at the University of Lausanne, bringing together again for the very first time scholars working on these matters in Brazil and in Switzerland and in Germany. The publication is still in progress, will be out hopefully next year. The discussions, however, are available online. And this is here that I'd also like to shout out to Andre Nicasio Lima, Aretusa Cruz, 2 colleagues and friends who have been working together with us for many years. Now, of course, these arguments are not limited to the Swiss case. They're part of a broader shift that we see in history writing. Historians working on other supposedly peripheral European regions, namely in Scandinavia or Eastern Europe, have been bringing forth similar arguments. My Finnish colleague Mikko Toivainen and I have tried to provide a framework for this research in a book published last year. This framework allows us not only to re-examine then Swiss, Finnish, Polish, Hungarian histories, etc. and so forth, but really prompts us to rethink European history more deeply and more profoundly. What emerges from all these case studies is the following. Yes, European empires always competed with one another. Yes, they were rivals, but at the same time in crucial fields, namely in finance, in trade, in science, in mission, medicine, technology, military organization, they very often also were very open to collaboration across borders. Why does this matter? Well, it brings us to one of the biggest historical questions that historians have been grappling with for the last few decades, namely, how was it then possible for this relatively small continent of Europe to dominate such large parts of the world? Of course, there's no simple and easy answer to this, but the Swiss case and all these cases do highlight something important. European imperialism was not only a set of competing national projects, it was also in many ways a collaborative project. This enabled European empires to draw on financial, human, intellectual, and other resources from across the continent, including these vast regions without colonies of their own or with only a very short empire of their own or with a landlocked empire, Switzerland being part of this wider imperial resource region. It is precisely this flexibility, the ability to mobilize resources beyond the limited national territories, that is something that needs more examination in the future if we are to understand this process of European expansion. Now, let me try and draw all this together for you a bit. What these examples show, I hope, is the broader agenda of this professorship. Again, starting here in Switzerland, digging where we stand, does not lead us to a small, isolated history. It rather leads us outwards into the world, shows us how Swiss society was shaped by and actively contributed to processes of European imperial expansion. But more than that, it also allows us to understand how, through which networks, which institutions, which ideals, which motivations. And in so doing, it also challenges how we think about Europe itself, not only as this continent of rivalry and competition, but one that developed infrastructure and practices of collaboration across many borders. Now, before we might raise a glass of fondant together, I need to add one more point that is important to me to this research agenda. I think we need not only to continue working outward, we also need to work inward, return back home in a certain sense. Because colleagues here in Switzerland, also elsewhere in Europe, have started challenging the views of, in the Swiss case, of the seemingly peaceful civilized society without violence in the heart of Europe for recent years. I'm going to just try and highlight this using two quick examples from many more that could be used. So returning to the idea of infrastructures and tunnels, one important question is, of course, about labor and migration. Elisabeth Schoris, Francesca Falk, Paolo De Martin, and many others have reminded us that most of these infrastructural projects that helped kickstart Swiss growing economy were actually built by companies recruiting labor from abroad, Italy and other southern European regions. These men worked mostly under extremely harsh conditions, were more or less forcefully separated from their families, had no or little political representation. Moreover, these infrastructure projects also relied on the unacknowledged labor of young women here from Switzerland, also with no political representation, and who have similarly been written out of history, but also out of the archives, because we have tons of photographs like this that only show the men, but never show the women, who also played a very important role on all of these construction sites. This is one example. The second example has to do with coercive welfare measures, and it is here that I rely on the work of Tanja Riedman, my partner and wife, who works together with many different historians, has shown over the past 2 decades or so, has kind of initiated this research field of coercive welfare measures. So this is part of an exhibition, an installation in an exhibition which shows 11,000 white dots. And each of these dots represents one surviving individual of so-called coercive welfare measures in Switzerland. Coercive welfare measures included forced child removal, placing children in institutions with farming families, making them to work for them, institutionalizing so-called work-shy or idle men and women, sterilizing unmarried women for supposedly deviant sexuality, and so on. All of this within a framework of Swiss democracy, but without legal process. Additionally, we have the case of the Swiss Yenish people, an itinerant minority that was also subjected to forced child removal practices. And here I'd like to shout out to Sylvia Süss, who has just recently published the biography of one of the most important civil rights activists from the Yenish people, Uschi Waser, whom we will hear more about later this year. Now, these measures were recently also recognized as crimes against humanity or as past injustices by the Swiss federal government. These 11,000 surviving victims represent only the tip of the iceberg. Coercive welfare measures were launched in the 1880s, running roughly 100 ideas, and historians reckon that several hundreds of thousands of individuals and their families, Swiss and foreigners, were in different ways targeted by these measures. Now, why are these examples important to me here? Well, I think, or what we see in our archives is this. These policies also emerged during the time of empire. Some of them have early roots in the 1820s, but they for sure hardened and institutionalized in the 1880s. These new forms of violent social control but seem to always have been connected with imperial violence abroad. We have only kind of very scanty evidence. One example is young men that we see escaping abuse from orphanages in Switzerland or workhouses, signing up for colonial armies where they themselves engaged in colonial violence, very often died there, or if they did return deeply traumatized. However, these historiographies, those of us working on Swiss colonial entanglements and those of us working on the histories of violence within Switzerland, these historiographies have remained parallel for the most part, a bit disconnected, which is, of course, exemplary also for international historiography in a larger sense. It has to do with a complicated problem, a framework that is still lacking that could guide our research. In the Swiss case, I would like to acknowledge Patricia Purchert, present also here today, and also Melinda Nach-Abonji. In different ways, both of them have argued or suggested that at the center of these still disconnected Swiss histories of violence, the external history and the internal history, lie the shared ideal of certain kind of white or civilized superiority, and at the heart of this heart of this ideal is represented by the idea of the hard-working Swiss man with political rights and a caring mother without political participation. This ideal, it seems, or as we know, was imposed violently on colonized populations abroad, as colonial historians have shown time and again. But it also seems that it was defended against those seen to threaten it within Swiss society, namely foreign laborers, poor strata of the Swiss society, ethnic minorities, or so-called deviant men and women. Importantly, this regime also placed those who tried to conform to it under constant pressure to maintain their status. Being, in a certain sense, a white, hardworking, civilized man or a white, caring, civilized mother was never easy, especially in times of economic uncertainty. It required constant self-discipline and the disciplining of others. This status was something that had to be protected, performed, and continuously reaffirmed. So let me try and summarize this, and I take inspiration here from James Baldwin, the Afro-American writer who visited Leukerbad, not far from here, in the 1950s, and on reflecting on his experience there as the first black man, as he claimed, to ever visit this village, remarked, quote, "People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them." So I think today we do understand that this large and violent history of European imperial expansion has affected all of us everywhere and continues to do so. It created this incredible wealth and welfare, however, distributed highly unequally, not least between the so-called North and the South. It has also left, however, lasting pain and unresolved historical trauma, both in the North and the South, and moreover, it also has led to this existential environmental crisis that we face today. I believe the question for us as historians is how does this shared violent history, how is this present in us today? How did it bring us about? And how, in vastly different and unequal ways, are we shaped by it? These are urgent questions in need of solid empirical historical research, I believe. So this professorship will for sure continue to dig here in Switzerland, connect these Swiss cases to the wider non-European world, continue to work together with our colleagues in Asia, Africa, the Americas, the Pacific, and elsewhere, who know the archives, who know the languages, but will also start examining empirically how these global entanglements affected those who stayed here in Europe and in Switzerland or migrated here from elsewhere. I believe the talk ahead of us is to create new narratives, replacing these old nationalist and Eurocentric narratives, so narratives that can include the voices that have remained unheard outside of Europe, but also within European societies, including Switzerland. Narratives that finally allow us to recognize our place in a wider history of humanity, humanity that always included vast inequalities, and that is now threatened by these ecological crises that we are all facing together. I am very much looking forward to carrying out this work here with my colleagues and other professors here at Unidistance, this young and ambitious university here in Valais, and would like to finish with a huge and heartfelt thank you to all of you who have been with me, have accompanied me all this way for several decades in some cases, and a huge welcome to all of you who will join us here in Valais in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernhard, for this very lively and inspiring talk that took us all the way to South Asia and back. And I'm sure it raised many questions, so this is the moment. Yes, David?
Yes, about these documents that are written in non-European languages, are they found in the archives,
of the European...
Sorry, can you please take the microphone? Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering about these documents that are written in non-European languages. Are they found in the archives of the European powers and colonial companies, or do archives exist that are non-European?
Yeah, some of them are to be found here in European archives, in colonial archives, in missionary archives, and in Basel has this huge missionary archives with documents written in all these different Indian languages, but of course most of them are then located either in the national archives in India or then in small regional archives, because the work that we are doing here in the Swiss case is hardly ever a work that looks at the relationship between Switzerland as a whole and India as a whole, which is of course huge. What we look at is kind of relationships with very concrete sub-regions, for example in India, for example, in the state of Kerala, and there are many local and regional archives in which we find these documents. But again, yes, that kind of necessitates or forces us, in a good way, I would say, to then work together with the colleagues from those often small local universities who can read these documents.
But were the archives established by the colonial regime?
Yes, in many cases, of course, they were. And in our time period, yes, they were mostly established by European or by colonial regimes, yes.
And those, they were using sometimes local languages to administer the colonial state.
Well, what I've been looking at, and this is a wide topic, so if you look at missionary society, yes, typically what they try to do is convert these populations by translating the Bible into their vernacular languages and then also publishing other kind of Christian texts for their goal of proselytizing. But, and this is then extremely important, then after a while, of course, this new generation of so-called converts or also others, they then appropriated this newly created written language, which kind of is rooted in their own language, and then writing, of course, their own documents, challenging, for example, and also the claims of missionary societies, etc.
In the context of the Swiss citizens like Dr. Goudron, who were involved in the Dutch colonies, what was the role, or did Switzerland as a country play the role in this involvement, or was it just like individuals' initiatives from opportunist citizens?
Yeah, excellent question. So when you drink your fondant, you can talk to Monique, who is sitting right beside you, who wrote an entire book about this, and also Philippe there. But in short, no, this is a very important question. So what we see is, so we're talking the context of the 19th century Switzerland. This is something I didn't mention explicitly, but for a very, very long time, Switzerland was one of the poorest countries in Europe. And we saw mass emigration. 250,000 Swiss emigrated abroad in the 19th century. So within this context, the Swiss federal authorities, but also cantonal authorities, they didn't really mind if some of these Swiss signed up to colonial armies, because this was less of a burden to their communes. However, the story then changes when they survived and came back, because when they came back, they were entitled to a pension by the Dutch colonial authorities. And it is then that we see an amazing activity starting from the local communes, for example, maybe here Brieg or even Naters, the canton of Valais, the Swiss federal government, petitioning the colonial government in The Hague to try and get this pension, or if they died abroad, to try and get the inheritance, because of course most of these soldiers had then also family back here in Switzerland who were poor. So there, the Swiss then government on all levels, they became extremely involved to get every cent back here to Switzerland that they were entitled to.
I also have a question, because I was struck by the fact that of Guglielminetti, which was from Brieg, and one may assume that most of these colonial traders, I don't even know how to call them, come from big centers, urban centers such as Geneva, Zurich, and of course Paris, London, and so on and so on. But the fact that it was also from Brig really tells a lot about the local inside this global transformation. So it's a very easy question. Did you see this everywhere in Switzerland, like on a cantonal base? Or it was only in specific cantons that this happened? Like, for example, was it the same in, I don't know, more so-called remote cantons such as Uri or the Appenzell or even Grisons, naturally? So that, yes, just this. Thank you.
Again, Monique is sitting right there. She has a whole chapter on Goudron. But no, it's an exemplary question. So, I mean, all the research that we have been doing, I think we're just getting away with this idea of there's any remote place in Switzerland. I mean, yes, it was remote, so we have to be very nuanced, of course, in the self-understanding. I mean, oftentimes the distance, they were huge. So it was very remote and also dire poverty, for example, in many of these regions. Nevertheless, it is always possible, and you know, I mean, you're a specialist also of Alpine history. I mean, the Alps don't only, the mountains do not only separate, they also connect people through the passes, through these very old trading routes that go back to the medieval ages. So what we see here in Valais, and I didn't mention this today, so Guillaume, Dr. Goudron's brother, he owned a restaurant here in Brig. And the 1880s is, of course, the time of where we see international tourism, etc., and so forth. So, I mean, the most obvious trading route for the people here in Brig is use the River Rhône that would lead them then all the way eventually to Marseille and the big French port cities, and from there the rest of the world. And this is also the dispute that Goudron in Sumatra had with his brother, because this brother here, importing all the goods for his restaurants, he always used French ports because he was actually sitting at the Rhone, close to Marseille, to put it that way. And this is one of the problems. He then sent the box here from Brig via France to Sumatra, which then involved many more fees that he had to pay. That is why his brother then suggested, well, don't use the Rhone, go over the mountains to Guschen and then to Italy, because then you can avoid fees. So, yeah, I mean, this is, one example.
I believe we also have a question online.
Yes, that's right. Me? A person, Amal, contributed to one of the answers you gave earlier. He said, we also found Basel Mission sources in churches that are not really traditional archives, and in KTC where archives are still being set up, all in vernacular.
Yes, this is our colleague Amal. Thank you, Amal.
Yes. And we have another question saying, do we still need Switzerland as a reference point for this type of research, apart from the political push against a national historical narrative?
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, because, I mean, we have to be, I mean, this is, look, different historians have different kind of attitudes toward this. Mine is this, I mean, the world we live in, there's a lot of talk that nation states are losing kind of their strength, and this might even be true. But at the end of the day, we still live in national news arenas, in national discourses. So my approach is, yes, we need to just take part in different conversations in parallel. There is a national story to be told. There is a national audience to engage. But in addition, and of course that is very, very fair, I also think that we should then also engage in larger discourses. So what I suggested, we also need to think more of a European history of integration that started not in 1945, but according to our view has much older roots going back to the time of empire. And at the end of the day, yes, I think it's a history of relationships. It's a history of humans and humanity that was created during this time of empire, bringing together everyone from on the entire globe, but at the same time, of course, also violently separating them.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's another one back there.
So when you're trying to write the history of people or phenomena that do not appear in the archives, how do you do that? How do you tease out information about them?
Brilliant question. There's a large philosophical, epistemological debate going on 20 or 30 years. So at some point, I mean, it is impossible. So I think we need to adopt two strategies. I mean, at some point, we also need to kind of highlight that for many of these reasons, I mean, think of Latin America. Up to 90% of the indigenous population did not survive European colonization because of illnesses and also violences, leaving no traces behind. So this is a massive, massive part of humanity that did not leave any traces. That, of course, we can never really capture their experiences and their point of view in history. So there, the strategy is we need to highlight that we have these very large holes in our historical record, and that we can know maybe as historians are maybe only islands in a vast ocean of stuff that is forever lost and unknowable. Having said that, however, I do think we can still push more. I think there are also methods of reading these sources that we have very closely, very critically. We often say reading against the grain. And as Amal pointed out, who is not here with us today, yes, there are still very many archives, small regional or local archives in India, all over Asia, Africa, and elsewhere that haven't really been accessed yet by historians, that are written in these very difficult languages for European historians, that therefore we need to try and analyze together with the colleagues from there. I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
Does archaeology have a role to play?
Well, in 1920, can. I mean, this is not something that I personally have engaged with, but there are colleagues who do so. And it is also, I mean, if I speak as historian of science, I mean, archaeology was actually invented in this time of empire in the 19th century. So there's also this angle that we need to critically also examine how archaeology then was also played a very difficult role, for example, conveying this idea. I mean, in Southeast Asia, in Java, Sumatra, you have all these old palaces. So conveying the idea that these great civilizations in Asia, they are past, they are in decline, whereas European civilizations are still flourishing. So this is a very difficult relationship that we have with the history of archaeology and archaeology, the colleagues from archaeology.
Maybe one last question? Yes, not a question online?
Not a question, but just a comment saying just a big thank you for this work and giving access to this lecture to so many of us.
And who is this from, if I may ask?
Not
Anonymous.
signed.
Well,
Anonymous.
Thank you, Anonymous.
So I think the last words have already been said online or read out by Marion. So I can just, add to that. Thank you very much indeed for this very inspiring talk. Thanks to the audience for coming here to Brieg. Thanks to those who were with us online. And I think now it is time to make the promise of fondant. Thank you.
Thank you.